In this video, you're going to learn how to build and deploy permanent stateful serverless functions with Arweave and EXM. Arweave is a protocol that allows users and developers to store data and applications permanently for a single upfront fee. EXM, or Execution Machine, is a protocol built on Arweave that allows you to build and deploy permanent, immutable, stateful serverless functions. A few points about EXM. First of all, you do not need to have a blockchain wallet at all. They provide a nice interface for creating and using API keys. Second, unlike traditional serverless functions, EXM functions are stateful. And since they're stateful, you can essentially use EXM as a database like we're going to be doing in this tutorial. To use EXM, they provide an HTTP API, an SDK, and a CLI. We're going to be using the JavaScript SDK. Now that we've had a brief introduction to EXM, let's go ahead and start building. Before we get started writing any code, you're going to need to go to exm.dev, create an account, and get an API key. You can do that by going to your dashboard and clicking on New Token. Once you have your API key, we can start writing some code. All of the code for this tutorial is also going to be linked below, both in a written tutorial as well as a GitHub repo. Okay, so to kick things off, I'm going to create a new directory called EXM app, change into it, and we'll create a new package.json by saying npm init --y. Next, we'll go ahead and open this in our text editor. And here we can have it ready for when we're ready to start writing some code. We'll go back into our terminal and we'll go ahead and install a couple of packages. We're going to need the Execution Machine SDK. We're also going to need the UUID package and chai for testing. While that's installing, we're going to go ahead back to the package.json, wait for maybe that to complete. And we will go ahead and set the type to module so we can have ES modules in our app. And that's kind of it. We have everything set up for us to kind of get going. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set our API key. And we're going to do that by going into our terminal and we're going to say export EXM PK, which is going to be like the private key, or you can call this whatever you would like. And then you're going to set this to whatever your API key is. So I've already done that. So I would say go ahead and do that and then come back and we will continue here. So once you've set your private key and your API key, we're going to go ahead and create our first file. And this is going to be a configuration file for setting up the instance of EXM. And this is going to be how we actually use the API key to call EXM. So to do so, I'm going to create a new file here. We'll call this something like exm.js. And in exm.js, we're going to first import EXM from Execution Machine /SDK. We're going to go ahead and create a variable called API key, and we're going to be kind of reading the process.env.exmpk or whatever you called that. And then we're just going to export an instance of EXM. I'm calling this EXM instance. You can just call this EXM or whatever you like, or you can follow my naming conventions. But what we'll be able to do from here on out is just import this EXM instance, and we'll be able to make calls against the protocol. So that's kind of just getting set up with EXM. What you need to do next is typically you want to have some type of state that you're going to be working with. And in our case, we are going to be building out kind of like a CRUD application. And this is a good example because this is typically what you need to do in most apps: create, read, update, delete. And for us, we're going to have something like a blog. So this blog will have posts. We'll be able to create a post, update, delete a post, and read posts, obviously. So for our state, we are just going to have like an empty state object to start off. And to do that with EXM, we're just going to create a new file called state.js. And in state.js, we're going to go ahead and have this constant called state, and we're going to export that, and then in that is post. Now, a post might look something like this, where we have, let's see here, maybe an ID, a title. We might have content and the author. And, that's going to be kind of our schema, but for getting started, it's just going to be kind of an empty object. So now that we have our state set up, what we now need to do is set up what's called a handler. And this is kind of how you manage updates to the state. So you start off with this initial state, and then you have a handler that updates based on some type of action. So for the handler, it's just going to be kind of like a function. And if you've ever used something like Redux and React, you might be familiar with this pattern, but we'll take a look here in just a moment. So I'll create a file called handler.js. And here we're going to have this export function called handle. And here we're going to have the state coming in as the first argument and the action coming in as the second argument. The state is going to be the current state of our application. And at the end of every single call for this handler, you need to return the state. So at the end of this, we can go ahead and assume that we're going to be returning that state. And then here we want to add our custom logic. And the main things that we're going to be doing in our handler for a CRUD application are going to be create, update, and delete, because we can just read the state whenever we need to. But for the actual updates, we need to kind of handle that here. So with that being said, we need to, how can we actually understand what's coming through every time this function is called? Well, you do that based on this action. And this action will have an input, which will be the different data coming in to make updates. So what we'll do with that being said, we'll go ahead and destructure that input. And here we can say if input, dot something will perform some type of update to this state, and then we'll just return that state. So the first type that we might look for is delete post. And if this comes through, it will be on the type, and the type will be delete post, and then we can kind of take some action. And here we're just going to delete the post using the post ID, and then we're just going to return the state. And then the other actual type of action we're going to look for are either a create post or an update post action. So if someone's creating this post for the first time, we will go ahead and say, okay, the post ID that's coming through will be set as the key, and the value will be set as the actual post coming through. And there isn't going to be a distinction between creating and updating, because if someone wants to update, we're going to ask them to pass in that entire object again. So therefore, the logic for creating and updating will be essentially the same, where we kind of have this key value pair. The posts will be the key, the post ID will be the key, and then the post itself will be the value. So that's all we really need for the handler. And the last two things we want to do are kind of have a way to both update the post in some type of separate function that we're going to call to provide all this information here. Where is this post coming from? And then we want to have a function to kind of read this. So to do that, we will create, first maybe to make this easier, we'll just have a read script. We'll call this read.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to import the EXM instance from exm.js. We're going to import this function ID, which we're going to have created later, because once we deploy our application, we're going to set that function ID locally, and we're going to have access to that. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to say we want to call exm.functions.read with that function ID. And then we want to go ahead and log that out so we can see what that value looks like. So for reading, we need that function ID. This is going to be almost like your application ID. If you've ever deployed a smart contract, it might be that contract ID. That would be a good example. We have the EXM instance from EXM. We have this call to EXM with that function ID getting the data back, and we just log that out. Now so that's reading. That's pretty straightforward, I think. I'm going to go ahead and close a couple of these files. The next thing we might want to do is create. So I'll do create post.js. And this is going to have a little bit more going on than just reading. We still want to go ahead and import both EXM as well as the function ID. We also want to go ahead and import the UUID library because we're going to need to set, whenever this function is called, an ID for each individual post. So to do that, we'll go ahead and create a variable called ID by calling UUID. Next, we'll go ahead and create an array for our inputs. And if we go back to the handler, you notice here that we have this input that comes in here, and we destructure it, and then we say input.type, and we have input.post. So like, where is that type in that post coming from? Well, that's coming from right here, where we have this inputs array, and we only have one item in this example, where the type is create post, and you should see that it matches the handler here for create post. And then the post itself is going to be like an ID. And then in our example, we're just hard coding a title, a content, and an author. So for us, that's the ID, the title is hello world, content is my first post, and the author is whatever you would like that to be. We will next say exm instance.functions.write, and we're going to pass in both the function ID and the inputs. And then finally, we're just going to go ahead and log that out. So for all of this to work, we've kind of set up most of the boilerplate. The only thing we haven't set up is like actually deploying that initial function and that initial state, because like we can't read and transact with it until it's already been deployed. So what we now want to do is create like a deploy script. So I'm going to create a deploy script called deploy.js. And first of all, we're going to go ahead and import this helper called contract type from EXM. Execution machine / XDK. We're also going to import the file system from Node.js for us to interact with the file system, because we're going to need to read, but also we're going to need to write that function ID locally so we can have it later. We also need the EXM instance again, and then we also want to import the state that we created earlier. And this is just that initial state that is this. So pretty basic for our initial state again. We next are going to use the file system to read the local file system for the handler, and we're going to kind of set that as the contract source. And we have everything we really need at this point to deploy this contract, because to deploy, you need three main things. You need the contract source, which we have here. You need the state, and you need the contract type. And for us, this is a JavaScript contract type, so we can say contract type dot whatever, and for us that's JavaScript. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and say exm dot functions dot deploy, passing in the first argument as the source, the second argument as the state, and the third argument as the actual type of contract this is. We'll log out that data, and then in order to read this later on, like in our other functions that we were reading that function ID, we need to go ahead and write that to the local file system. So in this case, I'm calling file system.write file sync, and this will just create a new file like here called function ID, and then here we're reading that function ID. And at that point, after we deploy, we should have everything set up. So with that being said, I think we have everything we need to go ahead and test this out. And then later on, we're going to add the update and delete functionality. And then we might even write a test. So to do that, to deploy this and to test it out, we're going to go back to our command line. And we should be able to run node deploy. And we should get some output that looks something like this. And we should be able to also read, even though we haven't done anything yet. It should just be an empty object. And there we go. We have the posts. So what we want to do now is node create posts. And if creating was successful, you should get some output like this. And then finally, we want to read that because we read it earlier and it was empty. Now we should have one post there. So I should be able to say node read.js again. And there we go. We have our post and all of our data is there and it's looking pretty good. So the next two functions that we're going to write are for updating and deleting. So I'm going to go ahead and create a file called update. And this is going to allow us to kind of send an update to that function. So I'm going to go ahead and first import EXM. We're going to import that function ID, and then we need to create a new input to kind of overwrite that existing input. So we, in our first input, we had the title as Hello World, and now we have Hello World v2. And for the content, it's going to say my updated post. But one thing you'll notice that's a little different is like for the ID, we need to actually provide the proper ID for an update because it's going to be kind of looking for that in that key value lookup. And in our example, in this tutorial, we're going to be just passing that in as a command line argument. So for us, we can get that by calling process.arg and getting process.argv and getting the third argument, which will be this number 2 and in the array. Okay, so that's kind of what that looks like. We're going to go ahead and call exm.write, and then we're going to log out the data. So when we run this, the way this is going to work, we're going to first read the current state. We're going to get that the ID for the post. We're going to then run update and pass in the post ID, and then we're going to read again, and we're going to hopefully get that updated state. So what I'm going to do now is test this out. So I'm going to say node read. Here's the ID. Now I'm going to say node update, passing in that ID. Well, I might need to format that into a string just to be safe. Okay, yep, looks like everything worked properly. So remember the initial title was Hello World and my first post. So if we read again, we see that the new title is Hello World v2 and we see my updated post. So everything worked as expected, which is great. And the only thing we want to do now is be able to delete. So to do that, we will create a new file called delete post. And this one's going to be pretty short. The only thing we need to do is have the inputs type as delete post and provide the post ID. So we'll import EXM and function ID as we've been doing. For our inputs, the type is going to be delete post and the post ID is going to be provided as a command line argument. And then we will call exm.functions.write, passing in the function ID and the inputs. And to test this out, we'll read, we'll delete, and then we'll read again. And hopefully, if everything works properly, there will be no more posts. So we're going to call read. We have the ID here. So we deleted the post. So now I should be able to call node read.js. And if we run this and nothing comes back, or if we have that empty post object, then everything is working good. And there we have it. Everything looks like it is working properly. So we are good to go. So this is great and all, but what if we wanted to just kind of test this out like locally in a script or something to make sure all this stuff was working? Well, we're going to do that next, and we're going to be using the Mocha testing library. So first, to kind of like continue on, you need to npm install g Mocha, and then once you do that, you should have this this Mocha like available. And if the command line utility is available globally, you should be able to kind of have that binary there. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a file maybe called test.js. And we are going to run through this real quickly. So we're going to import the file system. We're also going to import some new stuff from execution machine that we haven't used yet, which will be test function, create write, and we will be doing function type. We'll be importing that state that we used earlier. We're also going to be using UUID, and then we're going to be importing expect from Chai. We also are going to go ahead and create a new ID, and we're going to be using this. And then we're going to also create a variable called function source that will be reading the actual handler and having it available to us as a variable. Next, we'll go ahead and create two inputs. One will be for create post, and one will be for update post. And this looks very much like what we did before, where we have the input type, and then we have the post. And then for the updated post, we have the same, the type, and then we also have the title and content as being a little different, so we can kind of make sure that that is updated, and we can test that out. Next, we'll create the last input, and this will be for deleting a post. The ID will be consistent across all of these, and the type is just going to be delete post. And I think we're going to have like 3 main tests that are going to happen here. The first one is we want to see if it will create a post. We need to close that off. There we go. Okay, so it should create a post. We are going to go ahead and create a new test function call. Here we're passing in the function source, the function type, the initial state, and then the write operations. And then we can now call this test.state, and we can actually get the current state after that action has been called. And then we can essentially run expectations against it. In this case, we're going to say we expect this ID to equal that. So we're going to say the value that came back, we expect that to equal the ID that we initially had declared at the very top when we use UUID. And then we also expect the title to equal hello world, which is the value that we set in that first, I would say, input. And then that's for creating a post. We also want to have a test for updating a post and deleting a post. So for updating a post, we're going to call the essentially the same method, test function, and we're passing in everything almost the same. The main difference is that we're going to be calling in 2 items here to this array, where we're only calling in one. Here we were calling in create write. Here we're calling in create write with create post and create write with update post. And if that was successful, then we should expect the value to equal hello world v2 as opposed to just hello world. And if that test passed, then we're good to go. And the last test is going to be for deleting. And here we're saying it should delete a post. And we're going to call create write with create post and then create write with delete post. And then we will be checking to see how many posts there are, and there should be 0. So we expect kind of like this length, which are essentially the number of items within the object to equal 0. And that's all we need. So that's everything we have set up for our tests. To test this out, I can go here, and we have that new test.js file here, so I can call mocha test.js. And everything is successful. And just to make sure that this is working properly, I might try to break this by saying, okay, we want this to say hello world or something like that. And we see it broke, so everything is working fine. So that's it for this video. Tried to make it kind of short as an introduction to EXM. As you can see, Arweave is very, very flexible, and there's all types of stuff that you can do. More and more protocols are coming out every day. So definitely check out more of the Arweave ecosystem. If you want to learn more about Arweave, check out some of my other videos. And thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and come back and check with new videos I have coming out soon. Thank you.